Hi there, I'm Jenn Cassetta, your Chief Badassery Officer. If you're feeling drained, hesitant, stuck in self-doubt, or you just have a case of the vlogs, the Art of Badassery podcast is here to help you unleash your mojo once and for all. We'll provide you with tips, techniques, and real-life examples of how you can kick ass in all areas of your life. You'll learn how to flex your mental muscles, rise above fears, and turn setbacks into superpowers. So let's enter the dojo and let's get to work. Welcome everyone to the Art of Badassery podcast. I'm Jenn Cassetta, your Chief Badassery Officer. And today I have such an important topic with a very special guest. Her name is Josie Cox. And Josie is a journalist, author, broadcaster, and public speaker. She's worked on staff for Reuters, The Independent, and The Wall Street Journal. She's been a freelance writer for countless other publications and appeared on CNN, ABC, PBS, you name it. She regularly contributes to the BBC and is a founding editor of The Persistent, a journalism platform dedicated to amplifying women's voices, for which she writes weekly. Josie is an associate instructor within the Strategic Communications program at Columbia's School of Professional Studies and serves on the board of the Grace Institute, a workforce training nonprofit that serves unemployed and underemployed women in New York City. She's also currently serving on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on investing in gender parity. Josie's first book, Women, Money, Power, The Rise and Fall of Economic Inequality, was published in 2024, and I cannot wait to dig in. Welcome, Josie, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenn.
I am just so happy you're here. First of all, I love having smart, brilliant women on this show and black belts in badassery. And that's what I think you are, because a black belt in badassery is dedicated to helping other people rise. And that is exactly what you do for a living. But because you do so many things, I'm just curious, what's your regular day-to-day activity like?
Wow. First off, I've never had a black belt in anything. So thank you so much for bestowing that honor upon me.
Now you do.
As for my day-to-day, as you've implied in your introduction just there, no 2 days look alike. I have a 6-year-old daughter. Being a parent always comes first. I usually get up and caffeinate and get her up and get her off to school and then come back and start work. And that usually means like trawling emails first off, which I think a lot of us can relate to. My day always includes a little bit of self-care because I've realized that I just need that to uphold my black belt and my badassery, in your words.
Yes.
So I'm totally schedule an hour a day to work out. I realize that if I don't do that, everything else falls apart. And then it's a mixture of writing. As you mentioned, I write for a publication called The Persistent, which is a twice-weekly newsletter. So I'm often writing that newsletter or editing it or commissioning. I have my own Substack as well called Women, Money, Power that kind of came out of the book. I'm working on a new book project. I pitch stories I'm writing for different news outlets, including Bloomberg and Business Insider and a bunch of other places. It can be any number of things. I've just come off a call with the board of the nonprofit that I sit on, which is really important work for me. It's so fulfilling knowing that I can help in a really tangible way. As you can tell, all over the place, that's exactly how I like it.
But it sounds like the majority is writing. You're sitting down to the computer. You are writing.
Yeah. Definitely.
Which brings us to the book. Women, Money, Power. When I saw that, I'm on Jill Daniels' Happy Women Dinner newsletter list. She did an event for my book, so that's why I know of her. But when I saw Women, Money, Power, I was like, I need to know what that is. I need to know more about it. And I need Josie on the podcast. I am still reading your book, but I'm 3/4 of the way done. I'm blown away. So I just want to read a little bit about Women, Money, Power is a compelling exploration of the fight for women's financial independence in America from World War II to today. Through powerful storytelling and in-depth research, Josie reveals the legal, social, and cultural barriers women have faced and continue to face in their pursuit of economic equality. I've been wanting to talk about money on this podcast for so long because it's so important, and especially for women. And there's so many aspects to it. But truly, what your book has been teaching me is history. I am getting like a master class in the history of women in finances and power in this country that I never got in school, that my mother never taught me. I'm like, keep thinking, like, Mom, why have you not taught me this stuff? You were going through all of it in the 60s and 70s and even 50s. I'm being raised in the mid 70s and 80s, and I wish I learned more of this stuff in school or from loved ones. So,
Yeah.
what made you write this book?
Similar to you, I have always, since becoming a journalist 15 plus years ago now, been interested in money. I started as a markets reporter, the sort of nuts and bolts of financial markets and stocks and bonds. And the reason I started in that place was because I graduated into the financial crisis. I'd grown up originally in Switzerland. I'd grown up speaking German, and Germany was very much like an epicenter of the Eurozone crisis. And so when I finished college, I knew I wanted to be a journalist, and my only sort of superpower was that I spoke German. So I managed to, against all odds, get this job as a junior markets reporter, as a liberal arts major, I should add, having never covered anything to do with finance or math or anything like that before. One of the things that dawned on me really early on was that money is not really about dollars and cents. Money is about power. And because of the capitalist systems in which we exist, it matters. It's all encompassing. Even if you think you don't care about money, you really do, because it affects everything you do and the way that you live and the opportunities that you have.
Just
And
that sentence alone, money,
right.
power.
Yeah,
I know there's a lot of people out there that are cringing right now just at that sentence, but you can't get around it. Money,
no,
power.
exactly. And I also never thought of myself as someone who cared that much about money. Like physical things didn't matter that much. I was much more of a kind of experienced person. But nonetheless, like regardless of where we stand on the ideological spectrum, on the capitalist spectrum, whatever spectrum you want to choose, money matters, right? And one thing that I learned as a journalist pretty early on was that the concentration of power, and therefore the concentration of money, lay with men, and white men at that. And what I mean by that is that as I was going about reporting on things that were happening in markets, doing my day job, I would always try and get like a balance of voices in my articles. And I would try and interview women as frequently as I interviewed men. And it was impossible because the women were just not in these positions where they were senior enough or qualified enough or deemed qualified enough by another person to be able to speak to a journalist at a major news outlet. I spent a few years working in Germany. Then I moved to London. I ended up getting a job at the Wall Street Journal, where I was a markets reporter. And then a few things happened, like 2016, 2017 time, which many of us will remember very keenly. One was that Donald Trump's first term started. And as someone who had been very consumed by this idea of power concentrations, I was truly floored by the fact that we could have somebody in a position of power, and this kind of power had credibly been accused of assaulting women, demonstrated such a unapologetic version of misogyny as of living. It was just baffling to me. And I'm sure many of your listeners felt the same. And I'm sure
Oh,
you
yeah.
felt the same.
And
But it,
again,
yeah, but it,
and hang on, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
Please don't lose your thought. Don't let me. I'm specifically fired up right now because A, I had 2 cups of coffee. B, I just taught my boundary workshop to a huge company where there was a case of a woman being under predatory behavior from a colleague. And now I flick open my Instagram and I see a tweet from the President of the United States that says, and I quote, "Has anyone noticed that since I said I hate Taylor Swift, she's no longer hot?" And I just thought, you can't even make this stuff up anymore. But the misogyny, and I had to say it when you said the word misogyny, is so rampant. And people can laugh that off all they want, but the realities of how that plays out in society is that all of us, not all of a sudden, but these people, men particularly, and a lot of younger men, now all of a sudden think it's okay to talk about hating women, hating successful women, talking about their looks even more than we already did.
And this, what I'm talking about was 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Almost 10 years ago.
That's why I had to bring it up, because this is now today.
going on, right? Absolutely. There's that normalization. And I remember walking around the newsroom and being like, am I living in some kind of alternate reality here? Because I am outraged. I am mortified. I am devastated. I am angry. I'm all these emotions. And it looks like other people aren't. Like,
And
why
you
are
didn't
we
even
so
live here.
Exactly. I was working in Europe at the time. Now, of course, we saw iterations of that sort of normalized misogyny other places, but the epicenter was really here. I ended up leaving the Wall Street Journal. I ended up working for a publication called The Independent, a national newspaper in the UK, as business editor. And it was around that time that something else entirely was happening in the UK, which was that for the first time ever, the government was mandating gender pay gap reporting, right? So we had been speaking about inequality in the workforce in abstract terms. And really, for the first time ever, every company employing at least 250 people had to publish an annual gender pay gap.
In the UK.
UK, yeah, in 2017. And I was leading the business desk of a national newspaper at that time. And I just thought, wow, this is an acknowledgement that this is a business story. We'd previously spoken about women in the workforce as a sort of lifestyle story or as just a nice to have little siloed bit on the side, right? But this has suddenly become a business imperative because shareholders are starting to care what inequality looks like because potential employees are starting to care about whether this company actually internalizes what they're saying and actually practices what they preach. And that was really an opportunity for me to make this a central part of our reporting and to really cast a light on it. Now, all of that being said, I was someone who always came into the conversation about inequality in the workforce and the gender pay gap specifically, thinking that I was literate and I was an advocate and I was smart and I could somehow navigate this on my own. And that I would never fall into this trap of being part of this data point. Then I got pregnant. And in our particular household, my partner and I decided that I would be the one who would take a step back from the paid labor market because he was earning more than me at the time. And the childcare that was available to us didn't fit around the schedules of our jobs as they presently were. I did that. And I had this weird aha moment where I looked myself in the mirror and I was like, wow, I'm actually part of the gender pay gap now in a extreme way. And it was then that I realized that I really wanted to make this a central focal point of my reporting. I ended up going freelance and spending a lot of time with my daughter and experiencing what parenthood was like, both as a human, also as like somebody in the labor market, a worker, right? And a part of somebody in the economy trying to reach their economic potential. We then ended up relocating to New York from London. I was mentioning this just before we came on air on the 13th of March, 2020, which is quite the day. A lot of people remember it.
That was the day we went into lockdown.
At least in New York, my husband had an opportunity that arose. We'd always wanted to spend some time in New York. So we thought, how bad can it be? We arrived and basically find out that everyone is in lockdown, everyone's socially distancing. So that was really eye-opening. But what I really noticed during those first few weeks and months in the US was that the inequality story is so complex here compared to anywhere else really that I had spent time. And not only is it gender, it's race, it's socioeconomic background, it's heritage, it's any metric that you can think of. And so I really decided that this time that I spent in this country as somebody who cares so deeply about inequality, I just really want to tackle this in an ambitious way. Wow. And then what happened was I got very lucky. I was offered a fellowship at Columbia Journalism School to go back to school for a year. And it was in the capacity of that I had this amazing opportunity to interview this business leader. Now, you've read the book, you know where I'm going with this, but it was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company who asked to be interviewed off the record. So I'll never be able to say who it was. And I said to him, what are your thoughts on the gender pay gap? Why do you think the gender pay gap has hardly moved over the last 20 years? Why do you think the women's labor force participation gap has hardly moved in 20 years? And this, of course, was the time when women were picking up the bulk of unpaid work, of childcare as schools were closing, as the economy was trying to grapple with this new reality.
Yep.
And he said to me, look, what I have to understand is that sometimes when a woman takes a temporary leave of absence from the paid labor market to have a baby, to take a maternity leave, when she comes back, she's just not as professionally ambitious as she was.
Wow.
Yeah. So
and
I know
what did you say to that?
I didn't,
Mhm.
right? I think that told me everything I needed to know. The fact that he was placing the onus squarely on women to fix themselves
Mhm.
in order to fix a system that is so entrenched and so problematic and so complex was really sad. And
Yeah.
I was angry. In the moment, I was furious. But I think as I digested it, I realized that this is actually the problem. There's this disconnect, why things are the way they are. And so I decided that I wanted to go on this journey back through time and figure out how we got to where we are today.
Mhm.
Again, I thought this book was going to be a book about money. And it was I was wrong because money is a gauge
Yeah.
of so much more, of power, of dynamics, of history, of everything. As you said at the beginning, it's a history book. It starts during the Second World War with the women who came into the paid labor market really for the first time. And then decade through that by decade, I unpack the biggest developments that led to women's economic empowerment
Yeah.
and the setbacks as well.
Yeah, I can sit here and wax on about why I think every woman should read this book, especially young women. This is a great graduation gift. Again, I'm thinking of my mother, right? And my mother's growing up in the 40s, 50s, 60s. She's living through all this progress, so it seems.
Mhm.
And I get to live through all this progress as well. And now all of a sudden, it seems like a lot of this progress is either going to be halted, has been halted, or even going backwards. And for one, I'm terrified for that happening. But I'm just wondering for younger women coming out of college who grew up without a background of this history, if they understand what going backwards looks like.
Yeah.
So I guess why is this so important right now for us to learn about history?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I've really been trying to get my head around this idea of backlash and going backwards
Mm.
and trying to figure out whether it actually is the right way to characterize the present moment.
Yeah.
And I feel like on the one hand, it's obvious, right? There's a war raging on reproductive rights.
Mhm.
How is that not backlash? Our civil rights are being chipped away every day. How is that not backlash? On the other hand, the whole trajectory of my book is ups and downs, right? This undulating narrative, this roller coaster ride of progress and setback.
Right.
And so the way that I am trying to, I guess, maintain hope and cling on to the courage and the energy and the strength to see a way through this is to acknowledge that we have been in situations before where it has felt like we're going backwards, but actually we've emerged again and we've continued. And that has been thanks to some really amazing individuals. Where do I begin? Hands down, the greatest privilege of working on this book was digging into the lives of these women who
Yeah.
unsung heroes, many.
Who I never heard of and have done
Yeah.
such amazing things in history for us. We stand on the shoulders of these women and yet couldn't name them. Rosie
Yeah.
the Riveter, sure, I've seen, the symbol, but who was she? Do you want to just quickly tell us who she actually was and why we should know who she is?
Totally. Rosie's so deep in my heart.
Mhm.
I guess just a mini step back. When I decided I wanted to write this as a history, I asked myself the question of, wait, where do I begin? Because the history of women's economic empowerment is a history as long as time. The Second World War seemed like a good place because it was a time when women came into the paid labor market in high numbers, really for the first time. And the second reason was that this was the late 1930s, early 1940s. This was a time that actually wasn't that long ago,
Yeah,
meaning
I know.
that some of these women are still around. And the whole kind of ethos of my book from the get-go was that I wanted to tell these stories as much as possible in the women's own words. And so I had this realization where I was like, I can actually give these Rosie the Riveters the opportunity to take the stage that they were never given. I dug around in newspaper archives and on Facebook and anywhere I could think of. And I found some Rosie the Riveters who are still with us. And one particular Rosie, and I use the phrase Rosie the Riveter very broadly to mean women in the paid labor market. I know we tend to think of like derivatives, right? Yeah. But I think it's fair to use it as a kind of all-encompassing phrase. I found this woman in Pennsylvania. Her name is May, and she was super receptive when I reached out. She was like, yes, I want to tell my story. Yes, I want to be the voice of Rosie's. And even though it was deepest, darkest pandemic, I traveled to Pennsylvania and I spent a few days with her, socially distanced in her garden, and just listened to her, telling her story, telling me what it was like to find your economic power at a time when women were so not powerful, didn't have the rights that we enjoy today. And then not only that, not only coming into that power and realizing that, but then also at the end of the war, being summarily sent back into the home and being told your place in culture, your place in society is in the home, raising kids and doing unpaid labor. And that, to me, I think, was one of the most striking things about this story, because on the one hand, it was a story of like victory and progress. It was also a story of what happens when the cameras stop, so to speak. She's pissed. Like, she's in her 90s and she's still pissed. And I felt like it was so inspiring to see that she used that anger to propel her efforts. And she's campaigned her lifetime to get the Rosie war efforts recognized.
Amazing. And yeah, the way I think I read it in the book was like, after the war, all these men are coming home. They're the heroes. They're getting recognized, as they should, right? And these women are just cast aside and forgotten about. And now these jobs, now that like basically corporate America wanted to hire the men and not hire women anymore.
Exactly.
So they had this identity. They loved it. They loved the freedom. They loved earning money. And now all of a sudden, there's no place for them anymore. And that's an identity shift.
Totally. And it was like shameful for a woman to take a man's job.
Amazing. One of the chapters was really about the pill, the birth control pill. I found that so fascinating, because this is, again, where women start to realize that they can have more choice and autonomy over their body. So can you just share a little bit of the story of the women behind it, who funded it?
Yes, absolutely. And I often get asked who was your favorite character to write about. And it's so tough. It's like choosing your favorite child. But Catherine Dexter McCormick, who I'm about to speak about, she was certainly up there. I can't stop thinking about her. She's amazing. Catherine Dexter McCormick was a woman originally from the Midwest. She was born in the late 1800s. And she was such a pioneer in so many ways. She was one of the first women to graduate from MIT. She was fascinated with the human body. Her brother passed away at a young age. She was very close with him. Her father passed away when she was a teenager. So she grew up very quickly as a result of those two losses, but also she became fascinated by why the human body fails, right? So she ends up going to MIT. She has to jump through all kinds of hoops and take all kinds of classes, right? And then she falls in love. This is a very cinematic story, by the way. Every time I tell it, I can see it being played out. So she falls in love just after she graduates.
Why isn't it a movie yet?
Why is it? If anyone's listening who make movies, get in touch. And so she falls in love with Stanley McCormick. And very quickly after they get married, he gets very sick. And he's later diagnosed with what we today would understand to be schizophrenia, a very severe case of schizophrenia. He could never live independently. He was reliant on care his entire life. And Catherine became really interested in this idea of what would have happened if she had his baby, his child, and passed that condition on to the next generation. So before we even had the words to refer to it as such, she conceptualized birth control. Amazing. It's a very long, complex story of how she then ultimately ended up contributing in such a major way to the development of the pill. But a couple of little episodes that I love to talk about. One was that she became close with Margaret Sanger, and I feel like it's always so important to acknowledge the very complicated legacy of Margaret Sanger as someone who has credibly been accused of being racist, of being a eugenicist, all of these things. Catherine was a little bit different. She was really spurred on by this idea of women's empowerment and independence. And she recognized that there had to be a way of separating sex and reproduction, right? And think how progressive that was. This was like the 1940s by this point, 30s.
And quick question, no one in any other country had this concept yet? Or
yes, there was like some efforts going on in tandem across certain countries, but certainly not in the way that we would recognize it today. One thing that Catherine did that I think sums up her personality and her spirit and her badassery, quite frankly, so well, is that she spoke many languages. She was very educated. And at one point, she traveled to Europe at a time when contraception was really criminalized in this country. She pretended to be a medical supplies buyer and she bought hundreds and hundreds of diaphragms, contraceptive diaphragms. And she ripped open the linings of her coats and dresses and she sewed them inside and she smuggled them back into the US, where she distributed them to women who needed them. And when I read that story in some obscure history book from many years ago, because it's not well known, I just couldn't believe that this was the genius and this was the ferociousness that she brought to her story and to this mission that she was on. So anyway, long story short, eventually she was a very wealthy woman throughout her life. When her husband passed, she became one of the wealthiest women in this country. And she used a huge portion of that wealth to fund the research and development into the oral contraceptive pill that became available in 1960. But I firmly believe that Catherine was the engine that got this pill onto the market and made
what
it
year was that?
1960.
1960. Amazing. And again, from there, now women are like clamoring for this pill, or so it seemed, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's definitely worth acknowledging that it was not like overnight this thing was available to everyone. As is the case today, reproductive health is very unequal. Access is unequal. But even more so back then, contraception was illegal for unmarried couples. So this was like the very beginnings of a kind of universally available birth control pill, but nonetheless, it was truly revolutionary.
Wow. Access to reproductive freedom, healthcare, etc. You would think in our country would be equal, but it's totally not. And that's part of what's making me so sad and upset these days is when people will talking about abortion now, which is also isn't that a whole other chapter? Was that part of a chapter?
Yeah. If you're 2/3 of the way through the book, then you've got that to come.
Okay. Yeah. It's like the conversation comes up around politics and people will just write it off and say, it's up to the states. And my immediate thought goes to that 12-year-old girl in Alabama or Texas or wherever, Florida, that, is a rape victim. But if she lived in New York, she would have choice. Her parents would have choice, right? She would have the choice to a different life. Yeah. And it just makes me so sad that why is that? Why should we just brush it off and say it's up to the states?
Yeah. I can't answer that question.
Right?
It is, as you say, it is an absolute tragedy. And especially when we're having conversations like this, that is when I struggle to not see this as a huge setback and as a backlash. I think that the one thing that I write about in the latter part of the book and towards the end is that we have politicized healthcare in a tragic way. One of the chapters at the end is it's centered around this interview that I did with this incredible lady named Ashley All, who was integral to the campaign in Kansas to get abortion enshrined in the Kansas Constitution. And I reached out to her after the Dobbs decision because Kansas, I'm sure many of you will recall, was one of the first states to actually enshrine abortion in the Constitution. And it wasn't expected to do that, right? As a state that was historically very red and had this very rich history of being a sort of anti-abortion stronghold. And I reached out to Ashley and I said, how did you do it? She's a sort of strategic communications expert. So her framework is communication and personal communication. And she said, it's about values. What values do we all share? Start there. You can work from there. And you can get to a point where you realize that actually we all want the same thing.
I can believe that for the most part.
And I just thought that was a really powerful message and kind of a notion. Of course, it would be way too Pollyanna-ish to say, if it can happen in Kansas, it can happen anywhere. And there are so many complexities and dynamics that have to be factored in. But I just love this idea of moving beyond the ideological spectrum, getting back to the human. Absolutely. And also, just as is always the case with conversations about inequality, not painting it as a zero-sum game. I think it's something that we need to be talking about more generally, that when we talk about women's empowerment, when we talk about women's rights, women's economic empowerment, that is not to say that we want to take something away from someone else. And it's this quote that the Sarah Grimke quote that RBG always like to use, and I'm going to butcher it now. I actually put it in the book, and if you have the book in front of me, you can probably correct me, but it's, we're not asking for a favor for our sex. We're just asking you to take your foot off our necks.
Exactly.
I think, right?
Yep. I love
And
that quote.
and I put that quote at the front of the book because it sums up what I am trying to say, which is that when women thrive, everyone thrives. We are not asking favors. We're asking you to level the playing field.
That's it. Exactly. Another part of the book that, well, two parts, and I think they were about both around in the 70s, correct me if I'm wrong, but both the Women's March, I'd heard about it, but not really. I didn't realize, I think you said 50,000 women were marching in New York City. Can you tell us like what led up to that? And then I just also want to, so I don't forget, the All Women's Bank that opened in New York as well. New York just seems to be like the hot spot for all this. And yeah.
So the Women's March, fascinating. It's that whole chapter really, chapter in history, not chapter in my book, that whole chapter in history really spins out of the second wave feminism and the work that Gloria Steinem had been doing with Ms. Magazine, and who I met, by the way. I met Gloria Steinem a few weeks ago, and I just couldn't even get words out. I think whenever we talk about things like the Women's March, I think it's so important to acknowledge the work of the women who were not visible. And the one particular woman who I profile in the book, who again I am in awe of and I will never stop talking about, is Pauli Murray. And she was somebody who, she was a legal scholar, she was an advocate, she was a civil rights advocate. She was one of the first Black women to be hired by a law firm in New York. And when she was working at a law firm, her summer analyst was Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Wow.
So she was one of these people who really shaped the lives and the thinking of people who we have heard of, right?
Yeah.
She was a pen friend to Eleanor Roosevelt. Many of these great feminists through history credit Pauli Murray with giving them that impetus and that framework to work with. She crafted a lot of the legislation that became civil rights legislation that we all rely on today. And yet she was completely written out of history because she was a Black woman. She was also gender fluid, likely, although didn't have the terminology to describe it as such at the time. I use her pronoun she because that is how she referred to herself later in life in her journals. It's also how her family members who I've had the privilege of meeting refer to her. So just by means of explanation, that Women's March was a culmination of so many things that we did see in terms of feminist movements, but also so many things that we didn't see. And it was a bringing together. And so I think that's why it was so important. Of course, with hindsight, it's also sort of tragic that this was the 70s and the demands that they were making back then have just still not been met. Universal childcare, equal pay, all of these things still don't exist. Really interesting. And then what was the second thing? Oh, the Women's Bank. Yes.
The Women's Bank. I was like, oh my God, brilliant. What happened to it? So
Yes.
yeah,
So,
just share why it was started,
yeah.
etc.
So one thing I wanted to do in the book was also highlight the finance industry, right? Because it is, because we live in such a capitalist society, a lot of power does lie in finance. And I got thinking, like, who were the real pioneers in the world of finance? And we know that Jane Fraser is the first CEO of a major Wall Street bank, and that was very recent. But what about before that? What happened? And so I came across Muriel Siebert, who was the first female trader on the New York Stock Exchange, and her story is fascinating. So that was such a privilege to delve into. And then
she was there for 10 years before the second woman joined her on the trading floor. That blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And the book is 1,365 Men and Me. I think that's, I'm forgetting my own book chapter titles here. Yeah. Because it was literally that. It was like thousands, hundreds of men around her, and she was just there trying to do her job. And then I started researching women who were pioneers in the investment banking space around that time. I came across Neil Godfrey, who is an incredible woman who has done all kinds of incredible things for economic empowerment and literacy. And she was one of the first women to be hired by JP Morgan Chase as anything other than a secretary, right? So she was a banker, and she was executing these multi-billion mergers and acquisitions and trades. And she was just a phenomenal trailblazer. And I know we tend to overuse that word, but that's really what she was, right? And she also helped start the first women's bank, which was really designed to give women credit when they struggled to get credit on their own without a male co-signer.
Right.
And I think that bank it's not around anymore today. Many made the argument that it was no longer needed after certain legislation came into effect, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, things like that. But nonetheless, I think it really represented such an important step in terms of signaling that, money is not just a man's domain. And again, I think it's crazy that this was all happening in the 70s. And yet, even today, women are still marginalized in the financial realm, in everything from personal finance to investing, which of course is troublesome at any time. But I think particularly now we're talking about things like the great financial wealth transfer, and women are about to inherit all of this money and have all of this economic power. And it is absolutely paramount that we make sure that they are equipped and that they feel included in this world of finance.
Ooh, I love that. And it just reminded me also, the very first episode of this podcast, if you haven't listened out there, you can go back if this is interesting to you. It was Jamie Fury Higgins and her book, Bully Market. What a great episode. Check it out if you missed it, but she talks about her experience on Wall Street. Oh, good.
Yeah, she's in the, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. There are just so many stories, so many lessons for us to learn. And I love that we're coming almost to this culmination, because I read that too. Going to be this huge transfer of money. Is that because of inheritances? What is this big transfer of wealth to women? What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's basically a function of demographic trends, right? Women are outliving men. We, on average, live a few years longer than men. And as a result of that, the passing baby boomers are going to be passing on money to women. They're going to be having more money than they ever have before. And it could be, it's hard to make exact estimates, but over the next few decades, trillions of dollars will be flowing into the hands and the accounts of women. And I think it's going to be a really interesting opportunity and a sort of really interesting era in financial market history. But it is absolutely critical that we make sure that women feel empowered to make the kinds of decisions that they need to make when they inherit all this wealth. And I think one example of that is financial wealth advisors are still predominantly men. We know that trust relationships are influenced by gender, right? Mm-hmm. It is just a natural human instinct to trust people more who resemble you, right? It's a familiarity bias that we all suffer from. And so we need to make sure that we have representation in the industry. We need to make sure that people feel heard and feel trusted.
Can you leave us with maybe one other thing? Like, how do you see that happening? How do you see us empowering each other as women with, for wealth building? Because whether you're going to inherit money or not, let's face it, a lot of us will not inherit all this wealth and have all this transfer of wealth. What should we be doing anyway, regardless of that, to make sure? I truly believe that when women have more money, the world will be a better place. When women have more power, the world will be a better place. So how can we help women do that? Get more money.
I think it's just having conversations like the ones we're having, right? Making those connections, connecting those dots, and understanding that money equals power, power equals opportunity, opportunity equals choice, choice equals independence. And you could keep going.
Choice,
it's basically
and freedom.
this huge
choice and freedom.
Yeah. And ultimately, you're responsible for yourself, right? Of course, I acknowledge that access to these kinds of things is extremely varied across the country and across the globe. But if you are in a position to educate yourself, to enhance your literacy, to advocate for yourself, then you need to be doing that, because everyone who is in a position to do that can also be an amazing role model and can illustrate for others how it's done, right? So I believe in network effects. I believe in the power of role models. I believe in the duty that we have to advocate for ourselves, to advocate for others. And also, because I'm a history buff, let's draw on history and let's talk about history and let's learn from history. Because even if some people are trying to erase it, it's not going to go away.
Oh, thank you for saying that, which is just another reminder that please go out and get Josie's book, Women, Money, Power. Read about it, share the stories, share the book, buy it for college graduates. Like, This is something that we all need to learn about, learn from, etc. So thank you for writing this book. I can go on and on, but the one thing that always stuck out for me growing up was my mother saying, always have your own bank accounts, always have your own money, always have your own education. No one could ever take that away from you. And it really stuck for me. And when I see women that have to rely on other people for their money, etc., like, I'm not saying it's wrong or bad or anything. That to me, it just feels so foreign because it's a sense of power and empowerment and freedom and choice and all of that. So anyway, I just want to close with that. But before we go, 4 rapid fire questions for you. Are you ready?
So ready.
What was your favorite food as a kid?
Pasta, probably. I'm a kid, right?
If you could have a drink with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and what drink would you have?
Oh, it would be Paulie Murray, 100%, who I was just talking about, the
Yep.
civil rights activist. The drink, I'm not a huge drinker, but I suppose I would probably have some Prosecco because it would be a special occasion.
Amazing. Favorite self-help or personal development book?
I wish this one were written by women because I feel like in the spirit of this conversation, I should be amplifying other women. But one thing that really taught me tons about bias and heuristics was Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And it was the original book on behavioral decision making and behavioral economics. And I remember reading it and being like, I understand inequality so much better now. So highly recommend that.
Great. And then last but not least, what's your favorite hype song?
Ooh, I'm a big 80s person. So like anything from the 80s.
Okay. We'll have to find an empowerment song from the 80s. Wonderful. Okay, Josie, tell everyone where they can find you, your book, your Substack, etc.
Yeah, so I have a website, josiecox.com, that has all the links that you need. You can order my book through that. You can also get the book wherever good books are sold. I'm on all the usual social media channels, Instagram, Blue Sky. I don't use Twitter anymore, but I have a residual presence there. I always love to hear from people. So do get in touch if you want to continue this conversation. I'm always happy to talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge, for writing this important book. I'm going to give it away as gifts. And
Yay.
everyone out there, thank you for listening to the end. I know this was a deep, juicy one. Please share this with other women in your life. Let us know your thoughts and make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. I'm going to have more episodes this season about money, all the different aspects of money. So thank you. Stay safe and go get that money, honey.